let's talk about the single largest and most destructive conflict in all of human history, World War II. In just the next few minutes, we're going to trace the path from a very fragile peace all the way to a global catastrophe that completely reshaped the world we live in today.
To really understand the scale of this war, you have to start with this one number, 60 million. That's the estimated number of people who died. It's a number so huge it's almost impossible to comprehend. And it really sets the stakes for the entire story we're about to tell.
So, how on earth did the world get to a point of such devastation? Well, this wasn't something that happened overnight. It was more like a storm that had been brewing for 20 years, with its roots right in the unresolved anger from the First World War.
You see, the peace that came after World War I was shaky at best. The terms forced on Germany were incredibly harsh, and that created this deep, simmering resentment. Then, as if that wasn't enough, in 1929 the Wall Street crash sparked the Great Depression, a worldwide economic collapse that left millions of people desperate and looking for some pretty radical solutions.
In that desperation led to a major fork in the road. You had democratic nations like the US and Britain who tried to fix things with internal reforms, but then you had others who turned to a much more aggressive path, fascism. This was a system that completely rejected democracy, but the state above everything else, and promised to bring back national glory through one thing: military conquest.
And this is where we meet the main players. In Italy, you had Benito Mussolini. In Germany, which was just devastated by war payments and out-of-control inflation, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party promised to return to greatness. And in Japan, the military leadership decided that conquest was the only path to get the resources their island nation needed. Together, these three would become the Axis powers.
So the path to war was really a series of aggressions that just kept escalating. Japan moved into Manchuria and then into mainland China. Over in Europe, Hitler was just tearing up international treaties, annexing Austria and then Czechoslovakia. But the real breaking point came in September 1939. In a totally cynical move, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union made a secret pact to literally carve up Poland between them. When they invaded, Britain and France finally had no choice. They declared war, and just like that, World War II had begun.
Okay, so war is declared, and Germany does not waste a single second. It unleashes this terrifying new kind of warfare that lets the Axis powers just steamroll most of Europe with absolutely shocking speed. The strategy was called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. The idea was to combine airstrikes, tanks, and infantry all at once to just completely shatter enemy defenses before they even knew what hit them. It was built for one thing and one thing only: a quick, crushing victory. And my goodness, was it effective? The Allies, they were getting ready for another slow, grinding trench war like the last one, but Germany just went right around them. In just a few weeks, France, a major global power, had fallen. It was an absolutely stunning collapse that left Great Britain standing pretty much all alone against the Nazi war machine. This quote right here really just says it all. From Norway down to North Africa, from France all the way to the Soviet border, the entire continent was basically under Axis control. Hitler's dream of a European empire was terrifyingly close to becoming a reality.
But Hitler's ambition, well, it had no limits. In a shocking act of betrayal, he tore up his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, a gigantic invasion of the Soviet Union. This opened up the Eastern Front, a vast and unbelievably brutal new theater of the war. At the same time, on the other side of the planet, Japan was expanding its own empire. The US tried to stop them by cutting off their oil supply, which for Japan's military was a life-or-death resource. Japan's response? It was desperate and it was decisive. A surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. And with that one attack, the massive industrial power of the United States was pulled into the fight, turning it into a truly global war.
So, by 1942, the Axis powers are at the absolute peak of their strength. They control huge territories, vast resources. But their seemingly unstoppable machine was about to hit a wall. The tide was about to turn.
And that's the big question, right? If you looked at a map in 1942, it seemed almost impossible. But a few key battles fought all over the world were about to change the entire momentum of the war.
It really all came down to these three critical turning points. In the Pacific, the US Navy absolutely crippled the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. In North Africa, the Allies managed to secure vital supply lines. And on the Eastern Front, the Soviets won an incredibly bloody but monumental victory at Stalingrad.
That battle stopped the Nazi advance cold and began the long, hard pushback towards Berlin.
And behind the scenes, the fight was getting more organized. 26 nations, led by what they called the Big Three, the USA, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, all signed the Declaration by United Nations. They all pledged to pool their massive resources and to fight as one until the Axis powers were totally defeated. So with the Axis finally on the defensive, the Allies went on the attack. This final phase of the war would be a relentless, coordinated push towards victory and the creation of a brand new world order. The strategy was pretty simple. Squeeze Germany from all sides. The Allies came up from the south through Italy, which led to Mussolini getting kicked out of power. Then, on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies launched the biggest sea invasion in history, landing on the beaches of Normandy, France. And the whole time, the Soviet army was pushing from the east, heading straight for Berlin.
Surrounded in his bunker in Berlin, as Soviet troops closed in, Hitler killed himself. Just days later, on May 9, 1945, what was left of the German government officially surrendered. After almost 6 years of utter devastation, the war in Europe was finally over. But the war wasn't completely done. Japan was still fighting, and fighting with a ferocious intensity. Allied leaders were looking at a grim reality. A full invasion of Japan could cost more than 1 million lives. And that led them to a new and truly terrible weapon.
In August of 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs. The first hit the city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 80,000 people in an instant. The second hit Nagasaki, killing another 20,000. The world had never seen devastation on this scale, from a single weapon.
Faced with that unimaginable power, Emperor Hirohito of Japan announced his country's surrender on August 15, 1945. The Second World War had finally, truly come to an end.
And the final cost? I mean, just look at these numbers. They're staggering. More than 70 nations were involved. 1.7 billion people, that's most of the world's population back then, were drawn into this war. And the final toll? 60 million dead, 90 million wounded. It is, without a doubt, the most catastrophic event in the history of mankind.
In the aftermath, the world created the United Nations with one primary goal: to make sure a conflict like this could never, ever happen again. But that really leaves us with a final question to think about. More than 75 years later, in a world that's still full of conflict, is that peace really holding?